Okay, so Brutus, the Anti-Federalist, as I mentioned in the last lecture, kind of a loose affiliation of people. In this class, we're not really worried with who they are, what their background was, what part of society they were part of, or whatever. A relatively loose assortment of people, not 1,000% on the same page, but again, a general set of common concerns, okay? They use pen names just like the Federalists use the pen name Publius. The Anti-Federalists use pen names as well, generally Brutus, Sentinel, the Federal Farmer, others. Brutus was one of the most insightful. And, there's a lot of interesting stuff. I think in the course packet, I include Sentinel. I think it's Sentinel 1, where you see some of the even personal attacks he makes against people like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, people who we now kind of put on a pedestal. He doesn't quite attack them, but basically says Washington, doesn't quite say he's not smart enough, but says Washington has been because Washington had endorsed the Constitution, as had Benjamin Franklin. Basically says Franklin is too old and doesn't really know what's going on anymore. Washington, great man, did a lot for this country, but has been too focused on other things to really understand government and to really figure out what he's doing. So he really can't take his opinion about the Constitution very seriously. So Sentinel and some paranoia, not even paranoia, but just some personal attacks, some somewhat, paranoia, for lack of a better word. And also some fairly high-level political theory, thinking about the nature of democracy, the nature of government. Brutus, more insightful, generally better, I think, a better understanding of the Constitution. And again, from a meaningful critic, from an insightful, serious-minded critic, you can often learn much more than from an advocate. Hopefully the advocate can do a decent job of explaining what's going on, but you can also, if the critic is, again, intellectually honest and serious and really trying to make the case, they may often understand things that are very important, okay? So it is with Brutus and the Constitution, okay? 2 of his essays are included in your course packet, okay? His first essay, the first major argument he makes is that the Constitution will create one central government and will abolish the states, okay? Why did he think that? In the Constitution, there is a clause, and a clause just basically means part of a sentence, okay? So you have clauses in contracts. When you're talking about the Constitution, if you say the necessary and proper clause or the supremacy clause, you're talking about the part of the sentence that deals with something in particular. So there is a clause in the Constitution that says Congress, basically there is, when they're talking about the powers of Congress, it lists specific powers, and then there's a clause that says, and Congress also has the power to pass any laws it deems necessary and proper to carry out the aforementioned powers, okay? Brutus focused in on that and said, what this effectively does, what this clause does is it gives Congress essentially a blank check, almost unlimited power to pass any laws that they think are necessary or proper to carry out these very broad powers like regulating commerce and providing for national defense and things like that, okay? He was obviously wrong that the national government would abolish the states, right? We still have states, they have an independent constitutional existence and a basis for independent existence in the Constitution. Still have states, he wasn't right about that. However, his understanding of how the Constitution worked and the fact that the necessary and proper clause would be the basis for a great and continual expansion of federal power or the power of the national government, that was largely correct. Sometimes people say, well, the founders didn't intend for the government to get this big, or they didn't intend for government power to expand in this way. Obviously, they couldn't foresee everything that would happen. They couldn't foresee the creation of nuclear weapons, and therefore the creation of a Department of Energy that would deal with, among other things, nuclear weapons. They couldn't necessarily predict that they couldn't predict all the details of how the country would expand across the continent and what that would end up looking like. And then the existence of trains and eventually automobiles, Department of Transportation, all kinds of things. They couldn't predict exactly what it would look like, but they did create a mechanism in the Constitution for Congress to expand its powers, and therefore for the national government or the federal government to expand its powers. An early example involved the National Bank. And the Supreme Court ruled that because, the state of Maryland challenged the existence of a national bank, and because it says, Congress does not have the power to create a national bank. We'll talk more about this example when we talk about federalism. And the Supreme Court ruled, no, it doesn't, but there's the necessary and proper clause. So if it thinks that a national bank, creating, chartering a national bank is a good way to regulate commerce, it has the power to do that, okay? So something that did not seem to be mentioned in the Constitution, the existence of a national bank and its creating or its chartering by Congress, was implied, okay? And we'll talk about this again when we talk about federalism, implied powers, okay? So Brutus was largely correct. Again, he was wrong about the specific detail of Congress or the national government abolishing the states. And that's because the necessary and proper clause and all the other federal powers that are listed in the Constitution are limited to some extent. Okay, so there is a limitation of what the government can actually do. It cannot act in blatantly unconstitutional ways, say by eliminating states. But the idea that the necessary and proper clause would become the foundation or the means by which the federal government would expand its power over time, he was absolutely right about that. Okay. Other concerns that he had was that why did he think that the federal government would abolish states? He was concerned that there would be competition for tax revenue. And so he was concerned about that federal ability to levy taxes, not income taxes yet. That didn't come until the early 20th century. But he was concerned about the federal government's ability to levy taxes. And he thought that would create competition with the states. And that's why they would eventually abolish the states, because his fear was that the national government would end up thinking that it could not really collect the taxes that it needed as long as it had to compete with states and their taxing power. But he was, again, aware of the ability of the federal government to collect taxes and therefore expand its power in some ways. The other insightful thing he understood was the national court system and the supremacy clause, and the idea that the national courts would, and what the federal Constitution said, and what the courts kind of interpreted as saying, would trump state laws. And in fact, the Supreme Court of the United States has the ability to rule even on the constitutionality of state constitutions. So not individual state laws, and ultimately even state constitutions, okay? So he was correct that this federal court system that the Constitution would set up would basically be above the states. And basically that's because the federal Constitution would be above the states. And if a state law, even something in the state constitution, even in the highest expression of law that a state can come up with, if it violated or was at odds with, clearly contradicted the national constitution, it would be unconstitutional. And again, nobody would necessarily review this immediately, but if it were challenged and if it went to the courts and ultimately to the Supreme Court, it could be struck down. So he was, again, understood that the creation of this federal court, of these federal courts, would be the mechanism by which the idea, which is there in the Constitution, that the national Constitution trumps or supersedes state constitutions. He was right about that, and he was right about the fact that the Supreme Court would be able to make that reality through its rulings. Federalists, meanwhile, were very concerned about the need for a national court system to adjudicate conflicts between the states. Because under the Articles of Confederation, there was no national court system, and therefore when states had conflicts, there was no one to actually resolve them. And so this was creating real tension between states, and the Federalists were even worried that there could end up being, actual armed conflict between states. Okay, so Brutus, he didn't necessarily think that the federal government was worse, or that people who were drawn to federal government were going to be worse. Again, unlike some of the other anti-federalists, he wasn't really about attacking Madison specifically, or people who were drawn to national political office specifically. He just thought that the federal legislature, because it's more powerful, would be more dangerous. And he focuses on the idea of a tyrannical impulse in human nature that you can't get rid of. And therefore, his basic view is the only thing you can really do is to restrict the power of government. You can't stop people from being tyrannical. What you can do is basically limit the power of the weapon that you give them in the form of the legislature or the government. And again, we'll see in Federalist 51, the Federalists basically say that's true, that desire for that ambition, that love of power is there in people, but rather than restricting the government, which isn't going to work because you need a government that's strong enough to actually govern and to achieve the goals of government, what you can do is set up a system where ambition counteracts ambition. And therefore, you don't need to worry so much about the tyrannical impulse. You can essentially set it to work for you. Okay, so first argument of the first essay is that the Constitution, excuse me, will create a national government and abolish the states. Okay, and then so logically he moves on then, okay, maybe that will happen. Maybe there will be just one central government and maybe that'll be great and it'll be better. So why will that be bad? And one of his first and major concerns is representatives. There will either be too many, if you try to represent all the different interests in all the different states, you will end up having too many representatives to actually have a deliberative body. You can't have, 10,000 representatives and have a Congress, right? That's too many people to actually meet and to do the work, the deliberative work, the debating that Congress needs to do. Excuse me. Or you'll have too few representatives. And then you'll have few enough that you can actually have a functional deliberative body in Congress, but it won't be enough to actually represent all the different interests, okay? We'll see eventually, Publius's response to this is, Congress will just be legislating on national matters. So actually, you don't need that many representatives. You really don't need a representative for Lawton, and one for Norman, and one for Altus, and one for the area of Oklahoma that's west of Altus. When you're talking about national legislation, one person can really represent that whole area. The kinds of issues and the kinds of laws that Congress are going to be dealing with will affect entire states and regions of states in very much of a similar way. So again, you don't need every single local interest represented, okay? But that was another one of Brutus's concerns, that you would have either too few representatives and you wouldn't actually represent people, and therefore they would know that they weren't being represented, and that would create a real problem with the first of all, with their experience with what was happening with the laws that were actually being passed. And then before too long, it would create a real problem with people's loyalty or people's attitude towards the government. And then again, the other possibility was you try to represent every local interest, and then you have too many representatives to actually have a functional Congress, okay? Again, factions, he thought that there were too many different factions, too many different groups across the country. Again, we'll see in Federalist number 10, Publius says that's exactly right, but that's going to be the great strength of the new Constitution. A standing argument for these different reasons, the fact that people would not be represented meant that basically they would not voluntarily obey the laws that were coming out of Washington, that were coming from the national government, and therefore Brutus was concerned you would have something like martial law to have these laws enforced. Again, that didn't quite happen. And the Anti-Federalists generally didn't think that there would be much of a national identity, that people would really start to think of themselves as Americans. They didn't think that they could really have a sense of identity that would expand such a wide territory and include so many other people. Again, people who are so different from them. Somebody in Massachusetts actually feeling that they had a fundamental similarity in identity with somebody in New York and somebody in Virginia and somebody in South Carolina. They were just skeptical that that would happen. Of course, it did happen. A national identity did emerge, and people generally voluntarily accepted the laws and so on passed by Congress and the national government. Some major regional differences, especially over slavery, but for the most part, this, they were concerned of it disintegrating much sooner than that. So generally speaking, that American sense of identity did happen. People did voluntarily accept the laws. But again, he was concerned diverse interests can't be attended to. Ambition is such a threat when you're talking about government, people's love of power. You just can't trust it, okay? That's the first essay. The second argument, the second essay is largely devoted to an argument for a Bill of Rights. Again, a bill, a specific list of rights that will be protected, which is what we now have, right? The First Amendment, you have freedom of speech, freedom of religion. We'll look at what that means specifically as we go on. Specific protections against the government if they're investigating you for a crime, if you've been arrested, if you're under trial, all kinds of things. So the idea of a Bill of Rights, we need to spell these things out. Okay, and he comes back to this idea of a social contract, and we've talked about that a little bit in some of the other lectures, but basically the idea of the social contract is that by nature, people are free and equal individuals, okay? You can think back to a state of nature before society existed. And in that state of nature, everybody was completely free and equal, and that was fundamentally what we are. And what we really care about is preserving that natural freedom, okay? You could argue with the assumptions there, but that's what, generally speaking, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists agreed with that picture, that we are pretty much individuals who really, really care about preserving this natural right, or these natural rights, these natural freedoms that we have. Of course, social contract, the idea is you realize in the state of nature that you cannot provide for or protect all of your rights as well as you could with some measure of cooperation, and in particular cooperation through a government, but you're not going to be able to do that without giving up some of your rights. You're not going to have a functional government and a functional society without restricting some of those freedoms, that absolute freedom that you would have in the state of nature, okay? But the idea of social contract theory is you give up some of your less important rights to have your most important, most fundamental rights preserved, okay? And Brutus basically says that this Constitution is asking us to give up too many rights, too many fundamental rights, which government is supposed to protect, not ask us to give away, okay? So again, some of the same ideas, some of the same conceptual background and ideas of the Declaration of Independence. So that was kind of his argument. We need a Bill of Rights. This Constitution asks us to give away too many fundamental rights. And again, if you want to keep it really simple with the Anti-Federalists, who were they? Opponents of the Constitution. What did they want? More power for the states, less power for the national government. What was their success? What did they end up achieving? The addition of a Bill of Rights, okay? So the Anti-Federalists, argued against ratifying the Constitution. There was a debate over whether or not to add a Bill of Rights. And once the Bill of Rights was added, then that version of the Constitution was formally approved by the states, okay? So, but those are some of the ideas of Brutus. Those are some of the specific arguments that he made against the Constitution. And again, some of them quite insightful and really understood something about how the Constitution would work and how the government it would create would work.